Ni hao. So in this video, as part of my series on Chinese philosophy, we're going to be talking about the Analects of Confucius. So Confucius's philosophy is really comprehensive, and so I'm definitely not going to cover everything in this brief video, but I want to give you some of the core tenets of Confucianism, because Confucianism is one of the most significant cultural forces in Chinese history, as well as Korean history and a number of other East Asian countries. So Confucius himself was a sort of scribe, scholar, historian, along with being a teacher of ethical philosophy. He lived from 551 to 479 BCE, which is almost immediately before the beginning of what's called the Warring States period. And so the Warring States period, along with the period shortly before it, saw tremendous amounts of societal breakdown. The traditional authorities were collapsing. There was corruption. There was widespread violence, and so on and so on. And so this period actually gives rise not just to Confucianism, but as we'll see in later videos, to Taoism and to legalism as well. So a lot of traditional Chinese philosophy develops during this period, and Confucius is right there in the heart of it. So a couple of key things to sort of orient yourself in thinking about Confucian philosophy. He makes a distinction between Chun Tzu and Xiao Zhen. By the way, I don't speak Chinese. My pronunciation is probably wrong. If anybody watching this actually does speak Chinese, I apologize. And also feel free to leave me a comment below telling me how much better I could do. But Chun Tzu is the ideal man or the gentleman, whereas Xiao Zhen is the small man. So this is one of the key distinctions for Confucius, is between the gentleman, sometimes called the sage, so Confucius has a sort of series of gradations of ethical goodness. The gentleman is at the top, or the sage is at the top, and the small man is at the bottom. So the gentleman has what's called ti, or virtue. That might be te. I don't know, because it's transliterated te, so I think it's t. Well, we'll call it virtue in English. So the gentleman has virtue and cultivates virtue. More specifically, that's an important point. The small man either doesn't have or doesn't cultivate virtue. The small man. So some of the virtues that Confucius thinks are most important are benevolence, or zhen, wisdom, courage, selflessness, and self-awareness. So the small man tends to be selfish, tends to operate from fear, tends to operate from anger. The small man is not respectful of the rights of Li. Li is the rights. And those are really central to Confucian philosophy. And I'll talk more about those in just a second. So the gentleman has these virtues, especially benevolence. And so Confucius talks about benevolence a lot. So I'll read you a couple of passages here relevant. So the other thing that's worth noting about the Analects is that this is a collection of sayings. It's not a book as such. It's a collection of wise sayings from Confucius himself, as well as from his chief disciples. So, at one point here, this is at the beginning of Book 12, it says, Chung Kung asked about benevolence. The master said, when abroad, behave as though you were receiving an important guest. When employing the services of the common people, behave as though you were officiating at an important sacrifice. Do not impose on others what you yourself do not desire. In this way, you will be free from ill will, whether in a state or in a noble family. Chung Kung says, though I am not quick, I shall direct my efforts toward what you have said. So that phrase sort of in the middle there, do not impose on others what you yourself do not desire. This is similar to what we in the West often refer to as the Golden Rule, which is usually presented as do unto others as you would have others do unto you. But here we have it presented in the negative. Do not do to someone else something you would not want done. That's an important difference. But this is the sort of core of Confucian benevolence, in a way, is to treat others as ends in themselves. And that's a sort of Kantian way of thinking about it, drawing on the philosophy of Immanuel Kant. But this idea that you treat other people as people in themselves. You treat other people, or you don't do to others something that you wouldn't want done to you. You engage with them ethically and empathetically. And so, why is this significant? Well, for Confucius, it's significant for a number of reasons. One of which is that this is how the individual attains ethical goodness. So we get here a couple of entries later. Sima Yi asked about the gentleman. The master said, the gentleman is free from worries and fears. In that case, can a man be said to be a gentleman simply because he is free from worries and fears? The master said, if, on examining himself, a man finds nothing to reproach himself for, what worries and fears can he have? So, benevolence and virtue are things that bring about a sort of inner ethical peace. And so that in itself is significant. We also have the importance of virtue discussed and maybe sort of stated much more directly earlier in the Analects, at the beginning of Book 2. Some of the most important passages. Actually, I would say one of the most important passages in Confucian philosophy is from Book 2, entry number 1. The master said, the rule of virtue can be compared to the pole star which commands the homage of the multitude of stars without leaving its place. There's another version of this that I've heard. If you've ever seen the TV miniseries movie called The Lost Kingdom, which is a sort of adaptation of Wu Chenyan's Journey to the West, the translation that they give is something along the lines of virtue is like the pole star which stands still while the lesser stars pay tribute. So that's a central sort of thing. This idea of being steadfast in virtue, steadfast in benevolence, in courage, in wisdom, in self-awareness, etc., etc. And then the next couple of entries for Book 2. The master said, the odes are 300 in number. They can be summed up in one phrase. swerving not from the right path. Number 3. The master said, guide them by edicts, keep them in line with punishments, and the common people will stay out of trouble but will have no sense of shame. Guide them by virtue, keep them in line with the rights, and they will, besides having a sense of shame, reform themselves. So, this is really important. Because one of the things that Confucian philosophy is meant to do is to create social stability. So, benevolence, virtue, these are things that are meant to guide society properly. And what Confucius is really interested in with that is the rites, li, rites or rituals. So one of the things we want to be aware of when reading Confucius is that many traditional societies, including traditional Chinese society from the 6th, 5th century BCE, social interactions between different groups were much more sort of tightly regimented than they tend to be today. So the way that, for instance, a student interacted with a teacher and a teacher interacted with a student was much more ritualized and much more sort of formal. The way that, and actually, I'm fairly certain this is true of Japanese, the Japanese language, and I think it's true of Chinese as well, but again, I'm not 100% sure. So if you know Chinese, if you know Chinese linguistics, leave me a comment down below. But I think in Japanese and possibly Chinese languages as well, there are actually different ways that you conjugate words depending on the person to whom you're speaking and your relationship with them. So in the way that, for instance, something like French or Spanish or Italian has different genders, and like Spanish, I know there's a difference between when you're talking with some verbs, the way you conjugate them, there's a difference between if you're talking to someone informally and if you're talking to someone formally. Japanese and at least I think some Chinese dialects have a similar thing, but a much more complicated system. So the language that you would use would actually reflect your position relative to the person that you're addressing. Whether you're their social superior, whether you're on equal footing, whether you're their social inferior, etc., etc. And so one of the key things that Confucius asserts is that if people behave properly, if they behave according to the way that society sort of society has ritually determined social interactions should occur, then society will have order and stability. So we get this in a couple of different places. So this is in Book 1. Yutsu, who is one of Confucius's most important disciples, said, "Of the things brought about by the rites, harmony is the most valuable. Of the ways of the former kings, this is the most beautiful and is followed alike in matters great and small. Yet this will not always work. To aim always at harmony without regulating it by the rites simply because one knows only about harmony will not, in fact, work." So this is an interesting point. Again, the first line of what Yutsu says here is, of the things brought about by the rites, harmony is the most valuable. Again, Confucius lived right immediately before the Warring States period. I mean, he dies in 479 BCE, and one of the I think one of the common markers that historians identify as the beginning of the Warring States period happens in 475, 4 years after he died. So Confucius is on the verge of this massive societal collapse in Chinese civilization. And here's his disciple saying, the rites produce harmony. So that's really significant. And it's further significant that he says to aim always at harmony without regulating it by the rites simply because one only knows about harmony will not in fact work. So what Yutsu is saying here is that we don't get to harmony because we want harmony. We get to harmony because we have followed the rites, because we have followed the rituals that structure society, and so we are all behaving properly toward one another. And the rites are tied up with benevolence for Confucius, because subordinating yourself to the rites and behaving properly toward others is for Confucius a form of benevolence. So going back to book 12, entry number 1, Yen Yuan asked about benevolence. The master said, to return to the observance of the rites through overcoming the self constitutes benevolence. If for a single day a man could return to the observance of the rites through overcoming himself, then the whole empire would consider benevolence to be his. However, the practice of benevolence depends on oneself alone and not on others. Yen Yuan said, I should like you to list the items. The master said, do not look unless it is in accordance with the rites. Do not listen unless it is in accordance with the rites. Do not speak unless it is in accordance with the rites. Do not move unless it is in accordance with the rites. Yen Yuan said, though I am not quick, I shall direct my efforts toward what you have said. So what Confucius is saying here, we've got a couple of important things here. First, he says, to return to the observance of the rites through overcoming the self constitutes benevolence. So again, benevolence is one of the highest virtues for Confucius. And essentially what we're getting here is the argument that it doesn't sort of align with one's selfish or egoistic impulses to comply with the rites, to behave properly toward others. But when you renounce that egoistic desire, that selfish desire, and you behave properly according to the rites, that's a form of benevolence. That represents a kind of self-sacrifice for the benefit of the other. And then in the second portion, after Yen Yuan asks that Confucius explain that he lists the items, the things that you do to be virtuous, he says, do not look unless it is in accordance with the rites. Do not listen unless it is in accordance with the rites. Do not speak unless it is in accordance with the rites. Do not move unless it is in accordance with the rites. So what Confucius is saying here is basically that everything in society is scripted. Everything is ritualized. There is a proper way to do everything, and you should never depart from that proper way of doing things, because this is how you demonstrate and cultivate your virtue, and this is how you create social harmony, social stability. Which again, in the years immediately before the Warring States period, that was a major, major goal.